Welcome back. You're watching Sky News Tonight. The top stories this evening. And a worker at the British Embassy in Berlin has been arrested on suspicion of passing documents to the Russian intelligence service. A new American intelligence assessment says that the Afghan capital, Kabul, could fall to the Taliban within 90 days. And undercover police officers have described the moments before they opened fire and killed a terrorist in South London. Well, next, those fears I just mentioned that the Afghan capital, Kabul, could fall to the Taliban within 90 days. Well, that's the prediction of a new American intelligence assessment, which comes after Taliban fighters seized 9 provincial capitals, no less, in the space of a week. Well, despite that, President Joe Biden says he doesn't regret his decision to withdraw US troops and said Afghan leaders had to come together and fight for themselves. So what now awaits the people of Afghanistan? Well, let's get the assessment of my next guest, the former Foreign Secretary David Miliband. He now works as president of the International Rescue Committee, of course. So very good to talk to you, Mr. Miliband. So after all that blood spilled, all those hundreds of billions of dollars spent, it seems that Afghanistan could be going back to where it was 20 years ago. Your reaction, your thoughts?
Thanks for having me on, Dermot. This is a deadly and dangerous situation for civilians in Afghanistan, who are the people served by the International Rescue Committee. We've got about 1,700 staff on the ground. All but a handful are Afghans themselves. So they're working for the future of their own country. And just to give a bit of perspective, we know around 5,000 people have been killed. Those are civilians just killed in the most recent fighting. We know that 30,000 people a week are fleeing the country. And we know that around 350,000 are homeless as a result of the fighting, notably in the provinces that you have mentioned. The proximate cause of this is obviously the decision to withdraw US troops, but you'll also know that I've been one of many people critical for a good number of years that the time when troops were there was not used to develop a stable political settlement for the country. And obviously the great fear at the moment is that the gains that are being enjoyed by the people of Afghanistan, the gains in education, in a range of other areas, even in economic development, although it remains a very poor country, are on the rack. I think it's premature to say that the gains have all been already lost, but there's clearly real danger for the people who we are serving on the ground today.
But does it tell us on that issue of nation building that it's a fine idea, but it doesn't actually work? You mentioned Iraq hasn't worked there, hasn't worked in Afghanistan, and in a sense the Americans following that analysis and cutting their losses.
Well, the only people who can build a nation are the citizens of the nation. But those citizens, especially in poor countries, especially in war-torn countries, need help from outside rather than hindrance from outside. I think that clearly the decision, the military decision, which, by the way, is not just an American decision. America had about 2,500 troops. There were 8,500 NATO troops, 10,000 contractors. So it's quite a big commitment that's being withdrawn. That's been decided. But the question now for all of us is whether or not that military withdrawal is matched by humanitarian, diplomatic, political withdrawal, because that really would increase the danger. Just to give you a sense of this, British aid to Afghanistan is being reduced from about $90 million a year down to less than $20 million a year. That's going to put on the line some of the gains that have been made in education, in healthcare. Someone who's leading a humanitarian organization, my plea would be that those Afghans, on behalf of those Afghans who have gained in the last 20 years, they need support from the outside world, even if it's not of a military kind, because nation building is their business, but they can't do it on their own, given the circumstances that they face.
Well, I mean, I'm just interested in your analysis, because there is such a long history. Of course, the early days overlap some of your period as Foreign Secretary. Was it going wrong then? What should have Britain and the Americans and others have been doing that they didn't do?
Well, I went to Afghanistan 6 times as Foreign Secretary between 2007 and 2010. It was one of the most dangerous and difficult situations confronting British foreign policy. And in simple terms, I think the mistake is as follows. The abiding approach, and I'm afraid it ran right through to the end, was that military endeavor should then be followed by an attempt to create a stable political system. I argued from the beginning of my time that those two things had to happen in parallel. And you asked, did the trouble start at the beginning? The beginning, after the Taliban were removed from power in 2001, was the Bonn Peace Conference of 2001-2, which excluded significant swathes of the Pashtun population from the southeast of the country. And so the difficulty of developing politics that's based on compromise in a country that's highly decentralized has been an abiding problem from the beginning of the effort. That's not to say that there hasn't been significant gains, which, as I say, have not yet been erased. But I think it's very important to learn the right lesson. And my lesson is that whether you're in the military, whether you're in diplomacy, whether you're in the humanitarian sector like I am, none of them work without an effective approach to a political settlement. And that can't be done sequentially, military, then political. They have to be done together.
So let's get to the here and now. I mean, obviously, you think the Americans shouldn't be leading this withdrawal. Of course, Britain has to go along with it. But the Defence Secretary has been saying it is a mistake and trying to get together some form of coalition through NATO without the Americans. Do you think Britain should try at least to stay?
Well, I hope you'll understand that as someone who's got an organisation with 1,700 staff on the ground, I'm not going to comment on the military side of it because that would just put them in danger. But I want to speak to four things that I think are really important straight away. One is the humanitarian aid agenda. This country faces COVID crisis. It faces drought in 80% of the country. They need foreign aid. Secondly, and importantly, I think it's vital that we understand this is a regional crisis, not just an Afghan crisis. It involves countries like Pakistan, in countries like Iran, all of which we have relations with. So that's important. This has to be dealt with at a regional level, not just a national level. Thirdly, it's vital that those who are in danger in the country, for example, because they've served alongside British or Americans as translators or interpreters, they must be given safe haven. I think that anyone who's in fear of their life should be given the chance to rebuild their life elsewhere. Fourthly, and very importantly, there mustn't be a political and diplomatic withdrawal. It's important that there's a retention of the diplomatic and political muscle inside the country. And those seem to me to be the right priorities for the present moment, which, as I say, is deadly and dangerous in all sorts of ways.
Just paint a picture for us of the current trajectory. If Kabul falls, if the Afghan government falls, the repercussions for Afghanistan, of course, and all the people there, including some of your own staff, but indeed for the entire world. We're talking many refugees, many of whom will end up in Europe. And potentially, I've talked about going back 20 years, could we see re-established a safe haven again for terrorist groupings? Al-Qaeda, they're still around, of course, and Islamic State and others.
Well, you're raising very important and appropriate questions. You mentioned the refugee danger. That is a real and present danger to the neighbouring states rather than to countries in Europe like the UK or the US. 30,000 refugees a week. That's 100,000 refugees a month flowing into Pakistan, which is already hosting 2 million Afghans, and into Iran, which has about 800,000. So the refugee challenge is predominantly in the region, although some will try to make it to Europe as well in fear of their lives. So there's definitely a refugee angle. It's also important to say that Afghanistan has always been subject to pressure from its neighbors and from great powers around it. China sees Afghanistan as important. Pakistan, for obvious reasons, sees Afghanistan as important. And for the last 20 years, Western countries have worried rightly about terrorist danger. That's obviously been degraded over the last 20 years, but that remains a reason to believe that what starts in Afghanistan doesn't stay there.
Just want to focus for a moment specifically on the plight of women there. I was talking an hour ago to the former women's minister in Afghanistan, and many reports now describing, as the Taliban retake areas, particularly young professional women being hounded, being forcibly married to Taliban fighters, escaping under cover, and indeed being killed in the streets sometimes. It is a terrible situation.
Well, I think you're absolutely right to raise this. There are two things I'd add to what you said. First of all, the greatest gains of the last 20 years have come to those women and girls who've been able to go to school, who've been able to get professions, who've been elected to parliament, started businesses, working as teachers. So there are real gains on the rack. But Afghanistan is a different country because of those changes and because of the aspirations and expectations of those people. Secondly, and vitally, we know that in all humanitarian emergencies, violence against women goes up significantly. And that's certainly the reality that Afghan women are facing today. There are staggering figures, about half of the population expecting gender-based violence. And that's one reason that organizations like the International Rescue Committee prioritize the needs of the women and girls who are our clients. It's another reason why I think it's so important for the outside world to stand with these women, because just saying to them, you're on your own, doesn't give them the chance to work on a fair playing field. And so I very much hope people recognize that it's not just for reasons of sacrifice that we should stand with them. It's for reasons that Afghanistan needs to be a more stable place. And if it isn't, it's a threat to the region and more widely.
We very much appreciate, Mr. Miliband. We are out of time. Your thoughts on Afghanistan. But just, if I may I squeeze in a question about, totally unrelated, about events in Berlin today and tapping into your deep knowledge of international relations. The discovery of, it seems, a Russian spy in the British embassy in Berlin. Are you surprised weren't those days meant to be over?
Well, I am surprised, not because the danger has gone away, but because I thought that we were much better at spotting the danger. But I have to plead that the first I heard of this, I apologize, was in the news headlines just before I came on. And one of the best lessons of being foreign secretary is not to talk about things before you know something a bit closer to a set of facts than are in a question. So I hope you'll allow me to dodge that one.
Oh, the old diplomatic skills haven't gone. David Miliband, great talking to you as ever. Thank you very much indeed.